Okay, so make sure that you're on the correct lesson. We're looking at the completing the square lesson. Um, can you guys, as a warm-up, please complete the do now? You can pause the video so you have time to try it. Okay, at this point, you've tried the do now for yourself and you're ready to check your answers. So for the first one, this is going to be just a nice quick add, multiply, factoring. So we're going to do x plus 8 times x plus 8. We needed things that added to 16 but multiplied to 64. Same idea here, except now I'm x minus 6 times x minus 6. Now you guys should be noticing that these actually were like repeats, right? Like technically I could write this as x plus 8 squared and x minus 6 squared. These types of trinomials where you can write it as the same thing squared are so important to us in Algebra 2 that we call them perfect square trinomials. Psst. Okay, so you're going to notice this pattern happening frequently in this lesson. For letter C, a little bit of a trick here. First, take out the greatest common factor, and then, oh my goodness, when you factor this, you're going to see, again, we had a perfect square trinomial, so that will factor like that. Okay, so for this lesson, and you actually talked about completing the square in Algebra 1, but we're going to remind you guys about it a little bit today. So you're going to be creating perfect square trinomials, and you're going to end up making it so you have something that factors really nicely, like this x plus 8 times x plus 8. So what I want to remind you guys is that I do have the steps written out here, so if you get stuck, you can go back up to the top of the page, okay? But I'm going to just run through how you solve by completing the square. And again, just like quadratic formula, you can always use this method. Even if something doesn't factor, complete the square will work. So the first thing you always have to ask yourself is my a value not a 1? Is the leading coefficient not 1? Here, there's an invisible 1. So we're good to keep going. We checked step 1. If it wasn't a 1, we'd have to divide by whatever the coefficient is, so it was a 1. Step number 2, move the constant over. So I have to move the 23 over. When I do that, I'm going to leave a blank spot. The same value is going to get added into that blank spot. The value that gets added here is going to force this left-hand side to be a perfect square trinomial. So in order to figure out what that value is, I have to take my b value, which is negative 12, and I have to take that, cut it in half, so you put it over 2. That's negative 6, and then you square that number. So this is going to be 36. If I add it to one side, I got to add it to the other. Okay, so on the right-hand side, I'm going to add my values together. And I think I made a silly mistake. That should have been a negative 23. Okay, better. So we're going to add our negative 23 and our 36, and we're going to get 13. And then here, my left-hand side, there's my perfect square trinomial. Watch, stuff that adds to negative 12 but multiplies to 36. That's going to be a negative 6 and a negative 6, but let's get fancy. And let's write it as x minus 6 squared equals negative, oh sorry, that was now positive 13. Okay, so what you want to think about here is they're asking us to solve for x. So if we have something squared and we're trying to get x by itself, we need to take the square root of both sides. When I square root both sides, I need to write a plus minus outside of here because I put the square root into the problem. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scooch my 6 over by adding it to the other side. We have now officially solved for x. Now, if you had wanted to, you could check this if you weren't sure if you got it right by using quadratic formula. But the directions said solve by completing the square, so that's what we're going to do. All right, what I'd like you guys to do is pause the video, and I want you to try number 2. Okay, at this point, you should have tried number 2, and I'm going to run through the work to make sure we have it perfect. So this should be x squared plus 4x plus blank equals 16 plus blank. Remember, to figure out what goes in the blank, you take your b value, chop it in half, and then you square it. So it's going to be a 4 and a 4. The left-hand side, we're going to factor. Remember, we made it a perfect square trinomial. Things that add to 4 and multiply to 4, 2 and 2. And this is 20. So here, x plus 2 squared equals 20. Now I'm going to square root both sides. When I do that, I have to remember my plus minus, and then I'm going to scooch the 2 over, so it becomes negative. Now, you have to be really careful because the directions ask for simplest radical form. So what I would do is, I am actually going to do this on the side for myself. I'm going to break down the 20. So 20 breaks down into 4 and 5, so it's going to become 2 rad 5. So actually, technically, the simplest radical form here would be this. Okay, make sure that you were careful with that. Now, what I want you to keep in mind is that in our last unit, we talked about this idea of imaginary numbers. So how do you get an imaginary number? You have a negative under the radical. So the other thing that can happen here, just like when we were doing quadratic formula, is instead of our answer looking like this, let's say perhaps we had a negative 20 under there. Then our solution would have had an I. And we actually know, just based on the directions for number 3, that this will probably have an I in it. So what I would like you to do for the very last thing on the sheet, because we're going to save number 4 for when I see you guys in class. If you look here, this is an example of when we have, like, this is really the same as saying 1/4 x squared equals x minus 2. If I want to get rid of that 1/4, I would need to multiply by 4. But then this would have to be multiplied by 4 also. So this is going to be x squared equals 4x minus 8. So what I'd like you guys to do for homework is I'd like you to actually solve this now by doing complete the square. And remember, your answer should have an I in it, so expect a negative under the radical. And you're going to bring this in tomorrow with your completed guided notes as you were watching the video. And we'll do number 4 together as our do now.